It was late afternoon, and I was tidying up the bedroom when I heard the door creak behind me. I spun around, and there stood Jared, my 23-year-old stepson, staring at the thing in my hands. My heart damn near stopped. How the hell was I supposed to explain this? The object wasn't exactly innocent. It was a big, garish toy, the kind that doesn't leave much room for polite small talk. I'd pulled it out of the drawer to dust the back of the cabinet, not thinking much of it. I thought I'd locked the door, but apparently, I hadn't. Jared wasn't supposed to be home yet. He worked at a local brewery and usually hung out with his buddies after his shifts. But there he was, tall and lanky, his dark hair falling into those annoyingly amused blue eyes of his. "What's that?" he asked, his voice hovering somewhere between curiosity and teasing. My face burned like I'd been caught in a lie. I dropped the thing like it was on fire and grabbed the nearest object, a throw pillow from the bed, to cover it up. "None of your business," I stammered, my throat tightening. But Jared didn't budge. If anything, he leaned against the doorframe, that smirk of his growing wider. "Relax," he said, his tone way too casual. "It's not like I've never seen something like that before." I wanted to disappear. The nerve of this kid, no, this man, standing there like it was no big deal while my world was spinning out of control. I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "Jared, seriously, get out of here. You shouldn't even be in my room." But he didn't move. For a second, the silence between us was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He wasn't looking at the pillow anymore. He was looking at me. His gaze was different this time, not the usual laid-back, half-interested look he usually gave me. This was sharper, more focused, like he'd peeled back a layer and found something he wasn't supposed to see. I felt something I shouldn't have, a flicker of warmth deep in my chest, followed by a sharp stab of guilt. This was wrong. So wrong. I was his stepmother, for crying out loud. Married to his father. I shook my head, breaking the silence. "Jared, just go. Please." He finally shrugged, holding up his hands like he was surrendering. All right, he said, his tone light again. But before he left, he gave me one last look, a look that sent my already jumbled thoughts into overdrive. When the door closed behind him, I sat on the edge of the bed, still clutching the pillow to my chest. My heart was racing, and I couldn't even bring myself to put the damn thing back in the drawer. It felt like something had shifted between us, something invisible but undeniable. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew I'd never see Jared the same way again. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake what had happened. I tried to distract myself, cooked dinner, folded laundry, even sat next to Greg on the couch while he flipped through old westerns on TV. But Jared's face, that smirk, and the way he'd looked at me kept replaying in my mind. Greg didn't notice my distraction, but that wasn't surprising. He'd been wrapped up in his own world for years, gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles, ever since he retired. I didn't resent him for it, not exactly, but sometimes it felt like I was more of a live-in maid than a wife. At one point, I glanced down the hall and caught Jared's shadow moving around in his room. I could hear the faint thump of music coming through his door, a low bass line that didn't match the quiet stillness of the rest of the house. My heart jumped for no good reason, and I forced myself to look back at Greg. He was snoring softly in his recliner, his chin tucked into his chest. He'd fallen asleep again, the TV still droning on. I thought about waking him, but what was the point? Instead, I got up and wandered into the kitchen, grateful for a moment alone. But I wasn't alone for long. Jared walked in, barefoot and quiet on the hardwood floor. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair messy like he'd just run his hands through it. "Hey," he said casually, opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. "You're up late." "So are you," I replied, keeping my tone light. He smiled, leaning against the counter. "Just unwinding. It's not easy living under this roof sometimes." That made me pause. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but there was something serious in his expression. "Nothing. Just, being back here. It feels like I don't fit anymore." I softened a little at that. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern. "It's just temporary, Jared. You'll figure things out. You're smart. You'll land on your feet." "Thanks, Melissa," he said, his voice quieter now. "I appreciate that." For a moment, we just stood there. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the space between us shrinking even though neither of us moved. His eyes stayed locked on mine, and that same flicker of warmth spread through my chest again. I cleared my throat and started wiping down the counter, desperate to break whatever weird tension was building. But Jared wasn't done. "About earlier," he began, his tone shifting back to that playful edge. You really don't have to be embarrassed. We're all human, right? My hand froze mid-wipe, and I turned to him, trying to keep my voice steady. Jared, let's just drop it, okay? It was an accident, and it's not worth talking about again. All right, he said, raising his hands like he was surrendering. But that teasing smile of his made my stomach do a flip. He walked past me then, close enough that I caught a faint whiff of his cologne. I didn't turn around, but I could feel him standing there for a moment before he finally left the kitchen. That night, as I lay in bed next to Greg, my mind wouldn't shut up. What the hell was happening to me? To us? To this whole house? I'd always been good at keeping boundaries, lines that weren't supposed to be crossed. But Jared had this way of bending those lines, even when he wasn't trying to. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made breakfast like I always did, eggs, toast, and coffee for Greg, a smoothie for myself. Jared was the last to come into the kitchen, his hair still damp from a shower. He gave Greg a casual morning and me a warm smile that made my pulse skip. The three of us sat at the table, the clinking of silverware and bits of conversation filling the air. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension, every time Jared's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or refilled coffee. It felt intentional. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze steady and impossible to read. Greg, of course, didn't notice a thing. After breakfast, Jared offered to help me clean up. Normally, he'd have vanished into his room or headed out with friends, so his offer threw me off. You don't have to, I said, stacking plates in the sink. I want to, he replied, already grabbing a dish rag. We worked in silence for a while, but the air between us felt electric. At one point, I reached for a glass at the same time he did, and our hands touched. Neither of us pulled away right away. You're different, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I don't know. You don't act like other women your age. I laughed nervously, stepping back to put some space between us. Well, that's flattering, I guess. It's not just that, he continued, his tone serious now. You're real. You actually listen. You see people. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the dishes. But as I scrubbed, I felt him standing close behind me. My heart was racing again, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there. Before I could gather my thoughts, Greg's voice called from the living room. Melissa where's my crossword book? The moment shattered, and Jared stepped back, giving me a small, knowing smile. I'll let you get back to him, he said, his voice light again as he walked away. I felt a mix of relief and something else, something I didn't want to name. I knew I was playing with fire, but some part of me couldn't help but reach for the heat. That afternoon, I busied myself with errands, anything to keep my mind off things. But when I got home, I found Jared sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard. He looked lost in thought, a far cry from the confident guy I was used to seeing. Hey, I said softly as I approached. He looked up, his face breaking into a small smile. Hey, everything all right? Yeah, I replied. You? He hesitated before answering. Just thinking about life, I guess. Where I'm headed. Where I should be headed. I sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. You're young, Jared. You don't have to have it all figured out yet. Maybe, he said, his gaze still fixed on the yard. Then, after a pause, he added, you ever feel like you're meant for something different? Like you're trapped in the wrong story? His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but the truth was, I didn't believe that myself. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. You're not trapped, I said, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. For a moment, he covered my hand with his, and the gesture felt impossibly intimate. I pulled away quickly, but the damage was done. Another line crossed, another boundary blurred, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it anymore. That evening, the sky turned dark with an oncoming storm. The air felt heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Greg had gone to bed early, as usual, complaining about an aching shoulder. I'd settled into the living room with a book, but I couldn't focus. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside me, something restless, unpredictable, and dangerous. Jared was in the kitchen, the sound of the fridge opening and closing carrying through the quiet house. I heard the faint clink of glass as he poured himself a drink. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway of the living room, holding 2 glasses. Whiskey, he asked, raising an eyebrow. I blinked, caught off guard. I don't usually drink this late. Well, maybe tonight's an exception, he said with a grin, handing me a glass without waiting for an answer. I hesitated but took it, the cool glass pressing against my palm. Jared sank into the armchair across from me, stretching his legs out casually. The lamp beside me cast a warm glow across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble on his chin. What are you reading? He asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. Just something light, I replied, holding it up briefly. Nothing exciting, he smirked. I find that hard to believe. I laughed softly, taking a sip of the whiskey. It burned, but it was a welcome distraction from the tension that had been building all day. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, the storm outside growing louder. But then, he spoke again, his voice low. Can I ask you something? I glanced at him warily. Depends on what it is. He swirled the liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it like he was gathering his thoughts. Do you ever feel stuck? His question startled me. It was eerily similar to the one he'd asked earlier on the porch, but now there was a different weight to it. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine. You don't seem like someone who should be stuck, Jared said, his voice low and steady. You're too alive for that. My cheeks burned, and I looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table. Jared, you shouldn't say things like that. Why not? He asked, his tone unapologetic. It's true. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I didn't want to acknowledge. I stood abruptly, needing to put space between us. I think it's time we called it a night, I said, avoiding his gaze. But before I could leave the room, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I froze mid-step. Oh, I muttered, my voice shaky. It's just the storm, Jared said, his tone calm. I heard him stand, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet. Hold on, I'll find a flashlight. I listened as he moved closer, the faint rustle of fabric as he passed me. Then his hand brushed against mine in the dark, and I sucked in a sharp breath. Sorry, he murmured, but he didn't pull away. His hand lingered, warm against mine, and the air between us seemed to shift. I didn't move, I couldn't. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was certain he could hear it. Melissa, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I turned toward him, even though I couldn't see him in the dark. But I could feel him, his presence, his warmth, his steady breathing. And then his hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently. This is a bad idea, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he replied, but he didn't let go. The first crack of lightning lit up the room for a brief second, and in that moment, I saw his face, earnest, vulnerable, and impossibly close. And then he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping his shirt as though he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. When the lights flickered back on, we broke apart, both of us breathing hard. The reality of what we'd just done hit me like a wave, and I stepped back, my hands trembling. This can't happen, I said, shaking my head. Jared didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. I know, he said again, his voice steady. But the damage is done. Narrator comment. Damage is right. That kiss was the match that lit the fuse, and I knew it. But even as I told myself it was wrong, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About him. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I avoided Jared as much as I could, throwing myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feel of his lips on mine or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, Jared appeared in the doorway. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm. I didn't look up. There's nothing to talk about. Yes, there is. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I sighed, setting the laundry down and finally meeting his gaze. Jared, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong. Is it? He asked, his tone challenging. Because it doesn't feel wrong to me. His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. You don't understand. If Greg ever found out. He won't, Jared interrupted. And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore. His words stung, partly because they were true, but that didn't make them right. This isn't about him, I said, my voice rising. It's about us, about the fact that this, whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible. Jared took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. Why? Because you're afraid of what people might think. Because you're afraid of what you might think. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Melissa, he continued, his voice softer now. I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away. You don't understand, I whispered. Then explain it to me, he said, his tone pleading. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So instead, I shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word. Narrator comment. I told myself I was doing the right thing by walking away. But deep down, I knew I was lying. To him. To myself. To everyone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of Greg's breathing beside me. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, none of which I could untangle. At some point, I got up and went to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would help calm my nerves. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Jared's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning against the doorframe as though he'd been waiting for me. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and charged. Then, without thinking, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever this was, this impossible, dangerous thing between us, it wasn't going away. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there wasn't a storm to blame, nor a flickering light to hide behind. This time, it was deliberate. It started in the laundry room, of all places. I was pulling warm towels from the dryer, the mundane rhythm of folding them offering some kind of escape. The house was quiet. Greg had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. You're always working, Jared said, his voice light but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. Someone has to, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He chuckled softly. Fair enough, but don't you ever get tired of it? Tired of what? Taking care of everything, taking care of everyone? When's the last time someone took care of you? His words cut through me like a knife. I turned then, clutching a folded towel against my chest like a shield. Jared, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having. Why not? He asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked so at ease, so unbothered, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp, searching, and impossibly focused on me. Because, I said, my voice faltering, it's not appropriate. Appropriate? He repeated, as though testing the word. That's not the same as honest though, is it? I wanted to argue, to shut him down before he could say anything else that would make this mess even worse. But before I could, Jared stepped closer, closing the distance between us. You don't have to pretend with me, Melissa, he said softly. I see you. I see the way you hold this house together, the way you keep everything running while everyone else just takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself? My throat tightened, and I shook my head, stepping back until I felt the edge of the counter pressing into my hips. Jared, this, whatever this is, it has to stop. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. Tell me you don't feel it too, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I couldn't tell him that. I couldn't lie to him, or to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. But this time, I didn't stop him. Narrator comment. That was the moment I stopped pretending. I told myself it was just one more mistake, one more line crossed. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I just didn't want to admit it. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We were careful, or at least, we thought we were. Jared was good at finding excuses to linger in the same room as me, offering to help with dinner, fixing a broken cabinet door, even volunteering to run errands with me. At first, it was thrilling, the rush of something forbidden. But the reality of our situation weighed heavily on me. I knew it couldn't last. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries, Jared came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I stiffened, glancing toward the doorway to make sure no one was there. Jared, I hissed, trying to pull away. Greg could walk in any minute. He's at the hardware store, Jared said, his voice calm. Relax. But I couldn't relax, not anymore. The paranoia was starting to eat away at me. Every time Greg looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Maggie, our nosy neighbor, waved at me from across the street, I felt like she could see right through me. "We need to talk," I said, turning to face Jared. "About what?" he asked, his expression unreadable. "About this. About us." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. "What about us?" he asked. "This has to stop," I said, forcing the words out. "It's too risky. It's not fair to Greg." "Fair to Greg," he repeated, his voice rising. "What about fair to you? Do you even hear yourself? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even think about what you want." "What I want doesn't matter," I snapped. "That's bull," Jared shot back. "You deserve to be happy, Melissa. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. Narrator comment. It's funny how someone else can see the truth about your life before you're ready to admit it yourself. Jared saw me, really saw me, in a way Greg hadn't in years. And that scared me more than anything. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Greg had invited Maggie and her husband over for dinner, and I was doing my best to play the role of the perfect hostess. But Maggie's sharp eyes seemed to be on me all night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. After dinner, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Maggie cornered me. "You've been awfully distracted lately," she said, her tone casual but her eyes probing. "Just busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Does Greg know?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Know what?" "Whatever's going on with you and Jared?" I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. Maggie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful, Melissa. Secrets have a way of coming out." Narrator comment. That conversation with Maggie was the wake-up call I didn't want but desperately needed. I realized then that this wasn't just about me and Jared. It was about the life I'd built, and how close I was to losing it. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying Maggie's words in my mind. I felt trapped, caught between two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning, Jared found me in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied, not looking up. "Protect us from what?" he asked, stepping closer. "From this blowing up in our faces," I said, standing and wiping my hands on my jeans. "Maggie knows, Jared. She knows." He frowned, his expression darkening. "How could she know?" "I don't know, but she does," I said, my voice rising. "And if she tells Greg?" "She won't," he said firmly. "You don't know that," I snapped. "You don't understand how dangerous this is." Jared grabbed my hand, his grip strong but not painful. "What I understand is that I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "You won't," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But we have to be careful, for both our sakes." The days that followed were tense. Maggie didn't say anything to Greg, at least not that I knew of, but the weight of her suspicion hung over me like a storm cloud. Jared tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge than usual. Then, one evening, Greg came home earlier than expected. I was in the laundry room with Jared, the two of us standing closer than we should have been. When we heard the front door open, we sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Greg called my name, his voice carrying through the house. "In here," I replied, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. Greg appeared in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the room. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, but then he just nodded. "Dinner ready?" he asked. "Almost," I replied, forcing a smile. He left without another word, but the look he gave me lingered long after he was gone. Narrator comment. That look. It wasn't anger or suspicion, it was something worse. It was like he knew, but he didn't want to admit it to himself. And that made me feel even more guilty. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in the laundry room, the way Greg's eyes had lingered on me just a second too long. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Whatever this was between Jared and me, it felt too big, too consuming to simply walk away from. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. It started with Greg coming home unexpectedly early again. But this time, it wasn't just the timing that caught me off guard. His face was tight, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the house and set his briefcase down with a deliberate thud. "Jared," Greg called, his voice sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Jared appeared moments later, his casual demeanor contrasting Greg's obvious tension. "Yeah?" Jared asked, his voice as calm as ever. "I need to talk to you," Greg said, his tone holding an edge. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the space between the three of us seemed to close in. "Sure," Jared said, though his gaze flickered toward me. I stayed frozen in place, unable to look away. Greg didn't say anything else. He turned and walked down the hallway, Jared following him with that same unnerving calm. The silence that followed seemed endless. I waited for what felt like hours before Greg came back into the kitchen. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes were intense, focused on something, or someone, in a way I'd never seen before. The tension was suffocating. Finally, he spoke. "You and Jared," he said, his voice low, tight with something I couldn't place. "I know." Narrator comment. Those two words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent weeks, months, trying to convince myself this could stay hidden. But the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to bury it. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I say? There was no excuse, no explanation that would make this right. Greg just stood there, his expression a mix of hurt and anger, and for the first time in years, I felt like he was really seeing me. But it was too late. The damage was done. Narrator comment. Looking back, I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought I could have it all, the stability of my marriage and the thrill of something new. But life doesn't work that way. Choices have consequences, and mine were about to catch up with me in the worst possible way. The storm had finally arrived, and there was no escaping it.